When you think of measuring a few thousandths of an inch of oil clearance and how important that clearance is, you can see why it might be very useful to have a tool that is easy to use and specially designed to give accurate results. That tool is Plastigauge. The principle behind Plastigauge is simple. Plastigauge is inserted between parts which need to have a specified clearance. As fasteners are tightened, clearance decreases between the parts, flattening the Plastigauge. The piece of Plastigauge becomes wider as it flattens, and this width increases as the clearance decreases. By comparing the width of the flattened Plastigauge to a scale, you can tell what the clearance is. Plastigauge comes in various sizes, and you need to select the range that is most likely to match the clearance you're measuring. For example, shown here are 3 size ranges, which can measure from 1 to 9 thousandths of an inch clearance. There are several precautions to keep in mind when using Plastigauge. First, Plastigauge is sensitive to heat, so make sure parts are not warm or hot, or the Plastigauge may be deformed or melt. Second, Plastigauge dissolves in oil, so be sure to clean oil from the parts to be measured. Third, make sure parts do not rotate during Plastigauge checks. Rotating parts smear Plastigauge, making readings inaccurate. The most common use of Plastigauge is for checking main and rod bearing to journal clearance. Let's look at what you need to be aware of when checking clearance on main journals. If the engine is in the car, or right side up on the engine stand, the weight of the crankshaft may affect measurement. You can use 2 methods to remove any clearance between the upper shell and the crankshaft. The preferred method is to place shims between the lower bearing shells and caps of bearings adjacent to the one to be measured. For instance, here bearings 1 and 3 are being shimmed with matchbook covers, so that number 2 can be checked with Plastigauge. The appropriate service manual contains a list of which bearings to shim when making checks. The service manuals also list an alternative method of propping up the crankshaft with a jack stand. Now, if the engine is out of the car and inverted, you don't need to support the weight of the crankshaft. At this point, let's run through the actual steps to check clearance on a main bearing journal on an engine that is inverted on a stand. With the bearing cap and shell removed, we wipe the journal and then place a strip of Plastigauge across the entire width of the journal, being careful to position it away from the oil holes. If the engine were in the car, we would place the Plastigauge across the bearing shell. Next, we install the bearing cap and shell on the crankshaft and tighten the fasteners to the specified torque. Then, after removing the cap and shell, we compare the width of the Plastigauge to the scale. In this case, clearance turns out to be about 1/1000th of an inch. Plastigauge can also indicate taper. If the strip is wider at one end, the clearance is not uniform from one end of the bearing to the other. Measuring clearance on a rod bearing journal is similar, except you do not need to worry about the weight of the crankshaft. Before making the measurement, position the crankshaft so that the piston moves just past bottom dead center. Now that we've looked at Plastigauge, see if you can answer this question about its use. Which of the following is something which has to be avoided when using Plastigauge? A, oil, B, heat, or C, parts rotation? The answer is all 3. Plastigauge is oil soluble, can deform with heat, and can be smeared by parts rotation.